including a little drawing of people standing up. The other thing too, Sam said he's going to bet all the money in his wallet. Which, if he's like me, that's not a very good bet. But who knows? This is worth what it is. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's just incredible to see so many people here. One thing I want to say before I get started is, and Sam kind of referred to this, and Nick referred to this, but nothing like this happens. We don't bring people together like this without a lot of hard work by a lot of people. And so I just want to start out by saluting all the people on STAN, all the people at GINet, and all of my great colleagues on the staff at Save Darfur who have been working literally night and day to pull this together. So give them a big hand. I think back, as I'm standing here and seeing all of you here, to 2004, when I first got involved in this issue of Darfur. And I went to the region in May of 2004. I went to Chad, and I went to the Chad-Sudan border, and I traveled up and down that border. At that time, refugees were still coming across on a daily basis. People were living under trees. They were exhausted. They were hurt. They were thirsty. They were hungry. They didn't have any shelter. I talked to dozens and dozens of refugees. I saw thousands, tens of thousands of refugees. And they all had stories. Many of you may have heard those stories. I've told them. Other people have told them. We've got Darfuris here with us today that can tell the stories. But one thing that really struck me as I talked to people is they believed that if people in the United States and the rest of the world heard those stories, that there would be a response. That people would stand up and people would speak out and people would come to their aid. And they believed that if they could just get the word out, that help would be on its way. And one thing that struck me as I talked to all of those people, and at that time I was working for the Holocaust Memorial Museum down the road, and I had the opportunity, the privilege to meet a lot of Holocaust survivors. And so many of those Holocaust survivors carry with them a sense of being abandoned during the Holocaust. 60 years later, people are still carrying a sense of abandonment. And what I saw among the refugees in Chad and what I've heard from Darfuris time in and time out since that first trip are people who are desperate not to be abandoned. And that's really ultimately our role, is to make sure that they are not abandoned. And I think that the remarkable thing is that now we have a growing constituency of conscience that has stood up and stood by those people and is continuing to stand by them, and as we just demonstrated, is willing to stand by them as long as it takes to end the genocide in Darfur. When I got back from that first trip, started talking about Darfur, there were other people involved. John Prendergast was involved. We convened a little meeting. And it was about, I don't remember how many people was it, John? 30. It was 30 people. We got 20 or 30 people in a room up in New York. And that was the beginning of the Save Darfur Coalition. And there weren't activists all over the country then. There weren't community groups that were full of energy and full of initiative and full of ideas. It was 20 people in a room. A couple of months later, we hosted a meeting at the Holocaust Museum of students, local student leaders from area campuses. And we had, I don't remember how many it was about 40. It was a good number, good kids, good students. And in fact, some of the students from Georgetown, they came with an idea, crazy idea it was. They wanted to create something that would be a model for other campuses. And they wanted to call it STAND, Students Taking Action Now for Darfur. And I think maybe you dropped the actual meaning of those words, it's just STAND. But they had this idea. It was just a few people in a room. But now, look at what we've got. We've got a movement that stretches not only all across this country, which is what you represent, but it actually is stretching all across the world. Increasingly, we've got partners in other countries that are also standing up and putting pressure on their governments. Because one thing we know is that governments are not going to act to save lives in a place like Darfur unless there is a constituency of conscience that demands it. And what is so important is that now we have that constituency. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got a long road ahead of us, as Sam said, but we've got an incredible constituency that is full of energy and full of power, and now we have an incredible opportunity to exercise that power, and we can't miss that opportunity. Before I talk about that window, there's just one thing I want to say, though, is that the need for us to stand up is as significant and as powerful and as pressing as ever. I just got an email this morning from a friend at a humanitarian organization who's on the ground in Darfur, and she sent me some numbers. She said that there are now 2.7 million internally displaced people inside Darfur, and that's up from 2.5 million in the middle of this year. In fact, more than 300,000 people have been driven from their homes this year. 300,000 people have been driven from their homes this year. Even worse, only 65% of the affected population is accessible to humanitarian assistance. And one of the things that I learned when I took my trips there that is kind of hard to imagine if you don't see it, when you're driven into a desert and your food stocks are destroyed and your wells are destroyed and it's 120 degrees every day, you can't survive without outside assistance. And that is one of the big accomplishments of our movement, is that in 2004, the Sudanese government was keeping assistance out. They were driving people into the desert so that they would die, and they weren't letting humanitarian assistance in. Today, there is a very strong humanitarian operation, but it's under pressure. And the important thing to realize, though, is that humanitarian assistance is not solving the problem. And that's what we've got to turn our attention to now, is ending the conflict. For too long, for too many years, our government and other governments have just been trying to manage this genocide and not end it. But now we have an opportunity to end it. With a new administration coming in, with Khartoum feeling new pressure that they've never felt before, we have a win.